So I'm going to go ahead and get started, introduce myself. My name is Allison Horrocks, and I'm very proud to be a park ranger with Blackstone River Valley National Historical Park. I'm joined tonight by Sparkle Bryant, who is on screen as Devin Kurtz. Sparkle is going to be our technological guru tonight, so if you have any issues, you can send a message to Devin, which will
Timucuan.
get to Sparkle. You can also feel free to drop questions in the chat at any time. We love to hear from you. So I'm joined tonight by Susie Cernacker as well as Ted Johnson, who are coming to us from Timucuan. And they're going to be talking to you a bit about the Kingsley Plantation, and we'll be exploring some of the connections between one of the sites that I work at, Old Slater Mill in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, and their site down in Jacksonville, Florida. Please feel free to keep populating that chat, telling us where you're coming from. And I'm going to go ahead and share some slides to get us going and thinking a little bit about that connection. Okay, so again, I want to thank you all for joining us. There are people who have actually come to all 6 of the Parked at Home lectures, and I want to speak for myself and my colleague, Mark Mello. We organized this series. We are so humbled that many of you chose to spend 6 Thursday nights with us, with rangers from all over the country, just thinking about connections between our parks. We thought a lot about this idea of 6 sites, 6 connections, and endless stories, and we hope that you'll join us if we conduct this series again and think about other ways that we connect to the more than 420 sites that make up the National Park Service. When we were thinking about how we wanted to tell a story connected to Slater Mill, we knew that we could go in a lot of different directions. We could talk to folks who work at another mill or an industrial heritage site. We could think about the landscape of Slater Mill. We could even look at the building that is just to the side in one of the photographs that you see here, the Wilkinson Mill, and talk about that history of innovation and engineering. What we chose to do is to talk about a topic that we think is really important to the future of how we do history at Slater Mill and to the future of how we talk about history in the United States. And that's really where Kingsley Plantation comes in. Just to give you some context about Slater Mill, it's marked as number 1 on the map that we have on our slide here. It's the site that is the furthest south along the Blackstone River in the map that makes up our park. Our park is kind of different in that Blackstone River Valley is not just one place. It's a connection of 6 park nodes, which is NPS lingo for different sites that make up one part of the whole. We decided to do Slater Mill last for a few reasons. It's the place that if people come from out of town, they're probably most likely to visit because it belongs to the American people and it's overseen by the National Park Service. So we are able to give regular tours there. We want to go a little bit deeper tonight into a story that we think is essential to understanding a visit to Slater Mill. And that has to do with the photograph that we have on the right. When we talk about cotton, we might be talking about the thing that grows out of the ground, or we might be talking about the polished, finished product. Slater Mill is considered important because it is America's first place where people are able to successfully operate a machine that spins cotton into thread or yarn. Why is that important for your life? At first glance, it might not seem like it is, but when we give tours of the building that is right behind me here, this kind of simple yellow mill building, we talk a lot about work and how work changed as a result of mills like this one and this actual mill in particular. In 1789, an immigrant named Samuel Slater came to the United States because he'd been working in a factory and he wanted to own a factory. He decided to come to New York State, and that's where he gets in touch with 2 merchants from Providence, Rhode Island, William Almy and Moses Brown. When he comes to Rhode Island, he's entering at a really contentious time. People are debating a lot of different things, and at the top of the day is a continued debate over slavery. This is going to have a huge set of consequences for his life and is going to shape the way that this mill gets its start. Recently, very recently emancipated people are among the early workers who build components for the mill. We know that this machine on the slide, Slater's first carding machine, was actually manually powered or powered by hand by a recently emancipated Black man from Providence, Rhode Island. Samuel Slater gets to work on this machine right away because the cotton that's arriving in bags is coming from places like Georgia. It's also coming from other islands, and it needs quite a bit of processing. That cotton is going to go through a wooden gin, such as the one, sorry, not a gin, through a carding machine, such as the one that you see here that was actually made by Samuel Slater. What's happening in that machine is the cotton is becoming workable for something else. Samuel Slater is really best known for this spinning frame, and this is still owned by the Smithsonian in the United States today. What's happening on this spinning frame is cotton that's already gone through a carding machine. It's already been essentially brushed, is getting pulled and spun into workable thread or yarn. When we look in the early logbooks, they typically refer to it actually as a yarn. Why is this machine significant? Previously, people had done most of this work in the United States by hand on a spinning wheel, or they'd simply imported it from England. Samuel Slater comes and establishes with his partners a mill where this will all happen by machine operated via water power. I mentioned that Slater is coming at a time when the world is changing. Slater is going to primarily employ young children and people from the community. He's coming just a few years after Rhode Island has decided that they will gradually emancipate people, gradually free people who had been held in bondage in Rhode Island specifically. A similar thing will happen next door in Connecticut in the United States. But he's also coming at a time where lots of very important people, including his investors, have built up a huge wealth by investing in the slave trade. That is going to be the source of the capital for the mill that they are going to build with Samuel Slater. The engraving that is featured on this slide actually shows a scene of one of the places, Cayenne, where some of the very first cotton is coming to be used in Slater's factory. So this is part of a larger chain where people are connected, different systems are connected all through the processing of this one plant. I mentioned that when Slater comes, there is this debate that is happening, and one of his investors is actually a huge and very vocal voice in this debate, and some people would say a pretty hypocritical voice. Moses Brown sees the investment in factories like what becomes Slater's Mill as a way to get away from the economy of slavery. That is not what happens. And there are people who have looked at Moses Brown and said, but how could he know? How could he know that the creation of these cotton factories would lead to a boom in slavery in the United States? Well, one of his own family members said as much in a newspaper in 1789. John Brown was hugely critical of this idea that these factories took anything away from slave labor. He says, I can recollect no one place at present from whence the cotton can come but from the labor of slaves. This is his own family member from a family that has made their wealth. That's important to us to talk about as being an essential story to how we understand Slater Mill, not as being a separate story or something far away, but fundamental to how we talk about the things that happened there. A few years back, there was a symposium at Slater Mill, and a really important scholar of Rhode Island history put it in a way that I think helps us to understand it best. She says that it's sort of absurd that people weren't talking about slavery when they were talking about mills, not just because of the fact that enslaved people harvested, planted, and cared for the cotton that made its way up to the factories, But she says it's like taking a tour of Wall Street, not talking about stocks and kind of distracting people with computers and desks. That's not what we're striving to do if we're talking about a carding machine or a spinning frame. Part of our goal tonight is to actually make that connection really come through and come out. That connection also continues past the early years of Slater Mill getting in operation. Within the first 20 or so years, there's a lot more mills that people are going to build all over Rhode Island and New England. Rhode Island especially will distinguish itself by making a particular kind of material, particular kind of cloth, and working with a certain kind of cotton. Some people will call this Lowell cloth. There is also a huge facet of this that is made in Lowell, Massachusetts. Others would call it Rhode Island cloth. After slavery is formally ended in the northern parts of the United States, and even after investors have stopped making money in the global slave trade, about 79% of the factories in Rhode Island that dealt in textiles made yarn or made cloth specifically for enslaved people. So, sort of closing that loop from bales of cotton coming from plantations, that being transformed into yarn or fully being woven into cloth from thread, and going all the way back to actually clothing the very people who are picking that same cotton. Also included a snippet from the same period of who's doing this work. We have very early on in the ledger women and children who are being hired, mostly children, to actually do the spinning and the making of that thread and that yarn. So to wrap up so that we can start to think a little bit more about our connections to this site in Florida and to this sort of larger global trade, it takes a while for this place to transform into something different. For several decades, the early Slater Mill is a place where people spin thread. They work Slater's machine. Gradually, if you've come to our other talks over the past few months, we've talked about other uses for this mill. It was actually a bicycle riding rink. It's a place where people ground coffee beans. It's a place where people made coffins. But starting in 1921, it was also a place where people came to learn about Samuel Slater. This is a very early photograph of what a tour looked like at Slater Mill, and we have a person talking about the carding machine. We also know that at a lot of historic sites, people didn't talk about slavery or the fact that slavery still continues today. At the time when this place was becoming a museum in 1921 and into the 1950s, you still have people who are working as sharecroppers, harvesting cotton in a situation not so different from what Slater would have encountered when he first came to the United States. Into the 1920s, lots of people in Providence made their wealth over being cotton brokers. This is just one snippet from a listing of people in Providence who worked in the buying and selling of cotton. So even when the mills aren't super active in New England, this is still a source of wealth for people orbiting around sites like Slater Mill. The top image on this slide is one of the first logos for the Old Slater Mill Association, a group that we are very indebted to because they preserved the building so it could be a museum. I've included two other photographs on this slide, one of a family of sharecroppers in a field of cotton in Louisiana, and another of an event that happened not far off from this becoming a museum, and that's the race riot that happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. While people were starting to think of this as being a very important place for that first machine that was able to spin that cotton into thread or into yarn, there's all of these people who are still living. They are still living in a context of forced labor on plantations, or they're fleeing. You start to see when this museum was being created, people fleeing the South to head to other places to try to start a new life. Tulsa is an example of that, and it's also an example of some of the backlash that people face in response. We're going to talk now about a place that seems really completely different from Slater Mill, but a place where we think there's a lot of connections in terms of what kinds of choices people have as far as where they work, what's their relationship to the land, and what can some of these things teach us. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing that. And we want to make sure that Susie and Ted are co-hosts, so they can go ahead and share their slides with us as well. She says as if that will happen by magic. Let me see.
Great. Well, hi, I'm Susie Cernacker. I'm the lead ranger at Kingsley Plantation, and but I wanted to give you a quick overview of our whole park. I work at the Timucuan Ecological and Historic Preserve. This picture here is showing an overhead shot of a good chunk of the preserve. We protect about 46,000 acres of wetlands in and around the city of Jacksonville, Florida. And we're a partnership with the National Park Service, the Florida State Parks, the city of Jacksonville, private land holdings, even the Navy has some bits within the Timucuan Preserve. But tonight we're going to focus on Kingsley Plantation. This picture here is a picture of the road going in to the park. Now, so this is the main road going into Kingsley Plantation. Now, back in the 1820s, when Zephaniah Kingsley owned the island, he would have actually referred to it as the Fort George Island Plantation. This was about 1,000 acres, and most of it, there was about 800 of that was tillable soil, and the rest of it would have been swamp. And as you can see in this picture, all of that was once the fields has kind of been growing back into Florida woodland here. But this is what the Sea Island cotton looks like in the garden. This picture was taken a couple of years ago in September. And Sea Island cotton is different than upland cotton. It is required to grow on barrier islands. It needs the sandy soil. It needs the high humidity that we get on these barrier islands on the sort of east coast of the United States. And it would have grown from about the Outer Banks on down to Florida and then into the Caribbean. And it's hard to tell the size of the plants there, so we're going to go with this one. When it is fully ripe, some of it will be over 6 feet tall, and so we'll come over my head in that image. So that picture is actually pretty early on. I'm going to guess around July when that picture would have been taken. And so we plant in February. We follow along with one of with Zephaniah Kingsley's nephew, Kingsley Beatty Gibbs, wrote a journal. He started it in 1838 when he purchased the plantation from his uncle. And, you know, like so many people, he decided that, you know, now that he's doing this new thing, he's going to write a journal. And so it runs for about 4 years, what we have. And it starts off with he's recording things just about every day. Then the second year, it's about once a month. By that 4th year, there's 2 entries, which basically looks exactly like every journal I've ever tried to do. But we follow along with it. He said that they would start to plant in March, and the plants will grow until the end of July when they start to come ripe, and we can start picking the cotton. And the picking season actually runs from the end of July to mid-December. So it's a very long growing season. And this here is what our crop looks like. You can see in with the fluff, we cut it with the husk. So people can kind of feel everything. They can feel the seeds, they can feel the hard husk, they can feel the spines at the ends of the husks there. And so it's a very tactile thing that we have. And we get all of the 4th graders and 5th graders in Duval County in the past have come out to the park. And so they learn about slavery by doing a task that would have been done on the plantation, which is get the seeds out of the cotton. Now, so this picture here shows the dichotomy. So you've got on the right-hand side that of the world of the slave owner, with right there on the river with plenty of breeze coming in and relative ease. And then on the left, you can see the beginnings of the slave cabins that are out there. And if you look behind the slave cabins, you can see that's where the fields begin. And so the fields went just like on the other side of the cabins and worked their way south from there. Now, Ted, I'm going to turn it over to you, and you can talk a little bit now.
So then what we try to do, at Kingsley, following with what you said, Allison, there are some challenges in interpreting, the institution of slavery, and of course it's different, the experience at all the different sites. There are differences, and so what we try to do at this point really is to humanize those that were enslaved, so that by using universal concepts, those that visit the site can make very relevant and direct connections with the challenges, the horrors of slavery. The tasks that would have been done in this area. There was a task system, so those that were enslaved would have had a particular task. From our understanding, it's to say if it's during the cotton season, as it were, as far as the cultivating, a 1/4 acre a day was an average for an enslaved individual, at least an adult. And then once that task was finished, normally around 2 p.m. or so, starting at basically the crack of dawn, then there were opportunities to, have the rest of the day to tend to their own subsistence gardens, dealing with their households. Mothers, of course, were often having to tend to their own households, because the males often had these skills that could have been utilized elsewhere. So not always particularly in the fields. As you see here, carpentry was very important. And so, and basically when you look at why certain individuals were chosen, selected to be brought over, it's because of their skills. So in addition to agricultural skills, such things as blacksmithing, ironworking, carpentry were also important skills to have for enslaved individuals. So then on Fort George, Kingsley would have often enabled those that were enslaved to rent themselves out, their skills out. And so, but here you see an illustration of the main house. So that was built in 1798 under a former owner of the plantation, McQueen. And so, we try to showcase these individuals and their skills. So you can see here that the work was very detailed. But then we also make sure that we're talking about the impact of these challenges. So resistance, and that resistance could have existed and manifested itself in several different ways. There are documented runaways from some of Kingsley's and his family members, various locations that they had. So it wasn't just Kingsley Plantation that was owned by Kingsley. He was a very successful and significant landowner. But in addition to that, there were other forms of resistance. Within some situations, there may have been uh, um, we'll say, protests from actually doing some of the work. And there are some indications, even in Kingsley's writings, where there were some challenges with some individuals who did protest having to work at times. And there were some punishments that I'll get into in just a moment. But in addition to that, it's just the idea of resilience, being able to survive under these circumstances. And so, what we try to do is let folks explore the cabins that are there. There are now, there remains of, you can see in this illustration, this is post emancipation, the same property, and also post the Kingsley era. But you can see these cabins that were also built by the enslaved individuals, and they're built out of tabby, which is a mixture of kind of locally found natural elements of sand, shells, oyster shells that are heated and burned, and then wood and ash is also mixed in, and it becomes kind of a coastal concrete known as tabby. And so that's a very significant building material. And so you can see here again, some illustrations of families that did remain on the plantation area as kind of sharecroppers in that type of a situation post-emancipation. And so we try to give some type of a voice, as it were, to those that were enslaved. So not only do we talk about some of the resistance and the resilience, but what helps to make them resilient? Well, this idea of community. You were bringing together Africans from various nations. So we know that throughout the history there of Fort George Island, with the different owners, there were enslaved Africans from West, Central, and East Africa, such nations as Senegal, Gambia, Guinea, Nigeria, Angola, Kenya, Tanzania. So often these individuals would pair up, marry even, and be in the same household. So you had this real unique diversity, that was formed within this community. And so, as Susie mentioned, there is basically an arc of these slave cabins. There were initially 32, there are 25 that remain. And we believe there may be a couple, at least, different reasons why they're in this arc. One may have been that the owner, Zephaniah Kingsley, who did enslave and marry a Senegal woman, a young girl, actually at age 13, eventually married her, and then she bore him 4 children. And Majidin Najai, at least that's one pronunciation, if it's the best. But she became known more as Anna Kingsley. And this arc may have been what she knew in her traditional village. So you have this arc that would be of those that were on the working class, that would be on a lower level, and they would kind of serve as a circular protection, as it were, to the larger house or the main house. The other theory is that this could be protection from those that may have been entering, not from the water, but from, Susie pointed out, through where the crops were, so entering the island that way. You can see here some other views. Also the inside there of one of the cabins. And so we have one that is covered to give a good indication of what the space would look like. And that one is one of the larger drivers, overseers, drivers' homes. Here's an example of the tabby being poured, and then a brick of the tabby there to the lower right. So again, this would be poured in layers, as you can see, this coastal concrete. Then as one layer dried, then the next layer would be added. But another key for us to learn about those that are enslaved, again, this is actually an island here in the Southeast, and like other barrier islands, many of those that were enslaved often had long periods where they were separated from the actual plantation owners. And so that kind of more remote location often provided opportunities for those that were enslaved to retain some of their traditional African customs. Really, this is what the core of the Gullah Geechee cultural heritage. And so what has been significant here on this site is the archaeology. In fact, these cabins served as really the beginnings of the idea of looking for African-oriented material culture, so therefore African-American archaeology. And so what has been found here, again, are representations of traditional African cultures. These blue beads that paint blue to ward off evil. Charms, you see house charms there in the middle. Iron, again, iron workers. Again, individuals that had those skills were considered very significant within the communities in Africa and then here in the States. And then to the right, we see a sacrifice, animal sacrifice. There are some remains of these sacrifices within the floors, the foundations of some of these cabins. And again, these are hinting to traditional African religious customs. This particular situation here, you have an entire chicken, the skeleton of a whole chicken that had been buried, again, near one of the walls of the plantation, of the cabin. And the way it is configured and laid very specifically replicates the Sankofa bird you see there to the right. So then in traditional African culture, the idea is that the birds is kind of looking back into the body. So looking back at the past as one is going into the future. So, you know, there's that saying that you don't know where you're going if you don't know where you've been. So that is rooted in African culture. We also want to make sure that we do share that there was we have evidence archaeologically of of youth, of children living on the plantation. One of the things that have been found, at least in one of the other sites, so there's more than one plantation site that we have within the preserve. In other words, called the Fitzpatrick Plantation ruins. But this corn husk doll. So this gives us some indication that there were children that were there. And again, if you think about it, those individuals that first had to spend those mornings and into the afternoons with the agricultural side of the tasks, then many had to go back and deal with child rearing. So very challenging and harrowing lifestyle. But we want to try to learn as much as we can, not only from what we find archaeologically or what we can do as far as research is concerned. We are connected, luckily, with several of the actual descendants of the Kingsleys. So both Anna and Zephaniah, their progeny. But then also we try to learn from the descendants of those that were enslaved, so the Gullah Geechee community. So one thing that has been a tradition at the plantation for many years now is called Kingsley Heritage Celebration. So it is, of course, a commemoration of some of the challenges throughout the history of those that were, not only those that were enslaved, but those that were the enslavers, because Anna herself did become eventually a property owner once she was manumitted, emancipated by Zephaniah. She became a property owner, both geographic and of enslaved Africans. So with that in mind, this heritage celebration also provides a platform for the descendants to think about and to have conversations about that heritage and that whole history. So again, opportunities to commemorate the history, but then also to celebrate the resilience of that African culture. So that's what I really wanted to share, and just kind of let folks know that, again, in echoing what Allison said, there are some challenges, but there are also some successes in interpreting and exploring the legacy of slavery in our sites. So it's something that I think is best when it can involve also the public and be a kind of a co-created exploration. So I'll end with that at this point.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Did you want to continue screen sharing, or like, did you have any
No,
other
in fact,
slides? Okay. No
Yep.
worries. We can keep it up if you'd like.
okay.
I'll just make sure we have a few of us so people can see us. So we did have some questions from the chat, and I want to encourage people to keep adding those. Of course, I have lots of questions I'd also like to ask, but for the two of you, Ted and Susie, Beth is asking whether is saying that cotton is an annual plant and new ones are grown every year. I think that's a question. So how does that actually work? And maybe you could talk us through that in terms of the way that labor was divided at a place like Kingsley. What does that cycle look like? You'd mentioned roughly the times of year when different parts of harvesting is happening, but maybe when is the most labor intensive for the actual growth of a cotton plant?
Yeah, sure. So the this plant is sort of they would plant it and then pull it burn the fields in December. So they're treating it sort of as a yearly crop. Theoretically, it could grow just year round. Now, every day there was a specific task that needed to be done. So it was all meant to last, to have like about a 6-hour sort of work day. So the amount of work that would be put into it. So generally a task would have been, say, weed a quarter acre per person, or planting a certain number of rows. And then once the cotton was up and it was time for the to be harvesting, it would be about start going into like weight. So you can get about a quarter acre of the cotton during like the height of the season, which is about September, October is when the bulk of everything, you got to get out there every day, or I have to get out there every day and look for our cotton. About a quarter acre would yield about 20 pounds per day out, but an enslaved person would be expected to pick about 100 pounds of that on a daily basis. And one year, Kingsley Beatty Gibbs got something like, or his enslaved workforce picked about 19.5 tons out of 60 acres of cotton.
So we had a comment from Steph, who was telling us that when she relocated to Rhode Island from North Carolina, her daughter told her classmates in Rhode Island that cotton is in fact a plant and not an animal product. So where she had come from in Eastern North Carolina, that's something that they had experienced. Coming up to Rhode Island, that's something people were less familiar with. There is sort of a famous line that we use at the mill a lot, which is that cotton did not grow along the Blackstone River, which seems like sort of an incidental or unimportant fact, except you can grow cotton, not for very long, on the grounds of Slater Mill. And we know that because it's been done. It doesn't go very far, it doesn't last very long, the yield is absolutely minimal, but it can be done. And part of why we talk about that is when Slater Mill was created to be a water-powered factory, it's situated where it is because the land was seen as having other assets. It was seen as being a great location to tap into the natural drop of a river. There was very little interesting growth there, and cotton long term was not really going to grow there in any kind of meaningful way. There's also the fact that by the time that this factory is getting established, slavery is illegal in Rhode Island from the perspective of the Gradual Emancipation Act having been passed. But I was struck when you were talking about this idea of task work and the way that mills really disrupt that for everybody. Because there are people who work for mills that have certain things that they are responsible for. They're more task oriented. But part of what's happening when the plantation you're located at is getting going, when this mill is getting going, is people are now motivated more by being paid in money, being paid in firewood. These are free workers, and they're also working to a clock, which is very different. So when you were talking about them working approximately 6 or so hours a day, really what they're bound by is finishing the task. Is that right?
Yes, correct.
Yeah.
It meant the task was set to take up a certain amount of time. And then once their task was completed, they, in theory, could then go home for the day and do things for themselves. But they might also find the enslaved would probably help their family members if they were struggling to do things to help get their task done. Even when if it's like, oh, they can go, the enslaved could go home, their job, the things that they would be doing would be things like repairing roofs on their own homes, or growing their own crops. So in a lot of plantations, the owner would provide food for the enslaved, but Kingsley basically provided, I think, like coffee, sugar, and bacon and everything. They were kind of on their own for everything else. And so in the cabins, the archaeologists, we have found in each cabin that was excavated, the remains of muskets and pistols. So back to that sort of that ark being sort of a protective measure. Kingsley did one year write an ad in the paper for one of his other plantations, an ad that looking for to hire an overseer who had Army or Navy experience to train my slaves as a militia. That was directly in the advertisement. But so they were, the possibility was for protection of the site, but they could also go and use those the muskets to hunt. And so there's evidence of deer remains in the cabins, along with other more domesticated animals.
And I think we should also clarify that the idea of this militia was that one of the challenges is happening around 1812, when you've got the Patriots, kind of a movement where Patriots were trying to seize and destroy many of these lands, hoping that they could then, once they would do that, then they may be granted, the land ownership of that land. And that was an unsuccessful, eventually as a movement. And so, but one of Kingsley's plantations had been raided, and there were, I believe, 41 enslaved that were taken. And with those Patriots, our understanding is there may have also been indigenous peoples that were involved. So there's a challenge that's there that's very real. So a cause for protection. And then one other thing, we've gone back to what was provided. I just read recently, we had a more recent report about the enslaved there with the hogs and corn that were utilized for the provisions of the plantation operations. Once all of those operations were handled, taken care of. Apparently, those that were enslaved then had the option that were offered what was left of things like corn and let's say pigs, hogs. So that was something that was another motivation, to be able to take care of work. But then there's something that was kind of offered, which is an interesting kind of a persuasion, as it were, because we've talked before about coercion, and having folks with this labor. So that was interesting. And then one other thing was very important was fishing. Again, you're in the middle of you're on an island. So fishing was very significant as a subsistence, form of food. I just wanted to clarify and add that.
Right.
Yeah. I'm sorry, Ted. Could I ask you to expound on the Patriot aspect that you mentioned? Because most New Englanders, when we think of Patriots, we think of the football team.
Think of
the football team, the New England Patriots, the Patriots.
So again, yeah.
I know that there was a kind of a war going on between, like, I guess the Americans and the Spanish, and trying.
Ted, I can handle that if you want.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So y'all have maybe heard of the War of 1812. Well, there was another war of the other war of 1812 is what we call the Patriot War, the Patriot Rebellion. And so this was basically men who went to the President of the United States at the time and said, we are at war with Britain. Britain and Spain are right now allies. Spain owns Florida. We think that Florida should be part of the United States so that Britain can't use Florida as a conduit to attack us here in Georgia. And so the president basically says, okay, well, if anything goes wrong, I don't know anything about this. But gives them the go-ahead to go, and they're like, we're going to go and we're going to attack St. Augustine and force Spain to give Florida to the United States. And so they do. They march down from Georgia. It is militiamen and like Navy and Army soldiers and sailors kind of, melded in with all of that. And they go down and they do actually manage to capture St. Augustine. But then things kind of fall apart because they're not official. And so they become a sort of rampaging mob through Florida. And so they go to all of these plantations and they attack them, steal things from them. So this is what happens at Laurel Grove, which was Kingsley's previous plantation. And the Fort George Island plantation, which was actually owned at the time by a man named John McIntosh, and all of the metal in the house was stolen. All of the original slave cabins were burnt to the ground. The original slave cabins were kind of in a row, couple rows next to the main road, the historic road, and those were all burnt to the ground. So when the Kingsleys wind up arriving here, they have to build that cabin ark. Well, so the Spanish government, is desperate to put a lid on this Patriot War, and so they have gunboats floating up and down the St. Johns River. And one evening, they are out by Laurel Grove, and the ship is hailed, and it is Anna. Anna at this point was 18 years old. Kingsley, when she turned 18, he freed her and the 3 children she had by him at that point. And she jumps through all the hoops to become a citizen of Spain. And she pledges allegiance to the Spanish crown, converts to Catholicism, and purchases her own property in the form of 7 slaves. So she goes from being enslaved to enslaver at that point. But she hails this boat, comes up on deck, and she says, there are men in my husband's house. I'm going to burn it down so that they can't utilize it anymore. And so she, leaves her children and slaves on the boat with, and gets out and goes across. And while she's gone, the Patriots see the boat, in the river and start firing on it. And so by the time she comes back, the gunboat captain is screaming mad. He's like, "You faithless woman, you lied to me. You're in cahoots with them. I'm going to drag you down to St. Augustine and put you in the stocks." And she says, "Well, hang on a second. Now, the thing about Florida pine, which is basically what all of these plantations were made out of, it takes a while for it to catch, but once it does, it goes up like very quickly." And so she had gone through that house lighting combustibles in each of the rooms. And so as she sort of like tells the gunboat captain to calm down, she kind of points towards the house, and they could start seeing smoke coming out of the windows, and all of a sudden, boom, it is completely ablaze. And then she says, "I'm going to go. I've got a little house on the other side of the river, and I'm going to burn that down too so they can't use it." And so she goes and does all of that. And we know all this happened because the gunboat captain wrote to the governor. He said, "This woman, she's a hero to the crown. She deserves land and gold." They gave it to her, about 1,000 acres for her role in the Patriot War. But now, of course, they don't have any place to live. Well, the man who owned the Kingsley Plantation, the Fort George Island plantation, was John McIntosh. And John McIntosh had been fingered by the Spanish authorities as being in charge of the entire Patriot War. So he finds himself needing to get out of town for a while. And so he says to Kingsley, "You can rent my plantation, kind of until the heat dies down." And so that's how the Kingsleys wind up there. And then that was 1814. In 1817, Kingsley buys the property outright from McIntosh.
Yeah, as Sparkle said, I think Patriot evokes a very different thing for some of our Rhode Island or New England visitors, not just in terms of football, but Patriot tends to mean someone who fought for the American Revolution as opposed to, against it. But part of what I love of that as kind of a sort of final anecdote as we get ready to close out tonight is a lot of times we learn United States history in these little pockets separate from each other. And we don't know that at the same time that there's this mill boom in New England, there is this fight over Florida, right? Or this continuation of the war that is actually what makes New England sort of the factory powerhouse that it becomes. If it wasn't for these battles over coastal trade, there wouldn't be as much of a push to build more and more factories. Part of what we talk about at Slater Mill is this was the only mill of its kind, the only place where children and others are spinning and making thread and yarn. It's not a terribly significant story. It's the fact that these kinds of places really change people's lives. They change how they work. And part of the goal to kind of connect these two stories is United States history then and now. It's not just one thing or the other. It's not the history of mills or the history of plantations. It's the history of mills and plantations really, unfortunately, being very bound up together. There was a question of, well, how did this cotton actually get to Slater Mill? And we know that in the very early years through logbooks, mostly the cotton was arriving in bag form, and people were actually moving the bags overland once they'd come to a local port on wagons and carts. So this is an incredibly intimate process in the early years. And I think it becomes such a much bigger and more diffuse thing by the time of the Civil War. The people involved are not known to each other, but there's this thing that actually ties it all together, which is the plant, cotton. It's the cotton that makes its way to these mills through human labor, that transforms, that gets brushed and spun into something that can be woven by someone else, loaded onto a cargo boat in later years, brought back down to the South and put on the backs of the same people who are picking it. We brought all of these different parks together for Parked at Home because national parks are special places. And we think it's really important that we have these sites. We hope you do also come and visit us so we can talk about this longer an hour is not enough to even really scratch the surface of these really complicated stories. But we're really grateful that folks came out with us tonight. We do tend to stay just a little bit longer and continue the conversation informally, but I want to thank everyone who's been with us and who's kind of taken this journey. We've gone to outer space, we've looked at canals, we've talked about a commune, we've gone to Washington, D.C. We have really run the gamut. We went into flight with the Wright brothers, and we really couldn't think of a better way to end the series than with a topic that we think is especially important. So I know I'll be around for a few more moments, but I really want to thank you for coming in tonight with us. Susie and Ted are still at their site, so they are the real deal. I am not at Slater Mill. It gets very dark there at night. So, but again, thank you. And also a special credit to Professor Steph West Puckett from the University of Rhode Island. She has been working with us over the past 2 months to get students coming to these talks. So that's been a really wonderful collaboration, and all the hype that you've seen online is from them. So we thank them as well. I'm going to go ahead